Welcome to Waypoints, the podcast of fly fishing travel. With helpful travel tips, news and events, destination profiles, great stories, and expert advice from seasoned and experienced traveling anglers, this is your backstage pass to the world of fishing travel. Waypoints is fueled by adventure and brought to you by Yellow Dog Fly Fishing, a hands-on specialty travel and booking company that delivers the industry's very best insider knowledge, logistical support, and trip preparation. Freshwater or saltwater, international or domestic, Yellow Dog has you covered. And now your host, Yellow Dog founder and director, Jim Klug.
So I'm sitting down today with fly fishing's most interesting man, Mr. Tom BIE, the founder, publisher, and editor-in-chief of the Drake magazine. He started the Drake in 1998 while living in Jackson, Wyoming, where he worked as a raft guide and spent most of his time chasing one of the 5 single women that actually lived in town at the time. Tom also covered the sports beat as sports editor for the local paper, which meant traveling hundreds of miles through the middle of nowhere to cover the very best in Wyoming 8-man football, which of course naturally led to a career in fly fishing. Tom, thanks for sitting down with me today. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
So the Drake magazine, 20 plus years of the Drake, actually 22 years, I think.
No, 21 this summer.
21?
Yeah.
All right, let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Exactly.
Are you surprised you're still going after 21 years?
I am kind of. I mean, to be honest, if I was talking about when it started, I didn't have any kind of
Was that the
long-term
plan? You're like, here's my 20-year plan. You're like, I'm going to do an issue.
Jim,
and
how
see what
long we know
happens.
each other? Do you think I had a plan? I don't have a plan for lunch.
Well,
I didn't have a plan for the Drake. Really.
That brings up a good point, though. We got to talk about this. So for the sake of full disclosure, Tom and I are pretty good buddies, and we've done a lot of traveling together over the years, been to a lot of strange places. You know, on top of that, we both grew up in the great state of Oregon. We both spent some time in the Army. We both found our way to the fly fishing industry. You know, 2 insanely high IQs. Obviously, a lot in common there. But, you know, there is one major difference, and that is that you can write. And I've always been impressed by that. I mean, not to blow smoke here, but I think you're one of the best in the game. Pains me to give you that compliment, but you are. And it's one of the reasons the Drake has been so successful.
Well, thank you. I can't believe you didn't mention that we were both Ivy League linemen. I mean, that was kind of I don't know if you were even aware of that, but yes.
Well, I didn't know the Beavers, the Oregon State was in the Ivy League, but that's cool.
I could have qualified.
Yeah,
sure.
it's the Dartmouth of the West.
It is.
No doubt.
It is. Everybody knows that.
Well, I got to ask you because we got to lay a little groundwork here. The Drake, tell me about the early years when you decided to start the magazine, because this is actually kind of a cool story. I mean, obviously you went into it for the sweet pro deals. And then it kind of took on a life of its own, and here we are all these years later. What were those first years like? And I mean, why'd you start it? What was your thought process?
I started it in part because I felt like there was good writing out there that wasn't getting published. I mean, that's a big part of it. And I was living in Jackson, like you said. I was actually in Wilson, technically, is where the first issue is published from. The big bright lights of Wilson was just west of Jackson, if you're unaware.
Home of the stagecoach.
Home of the stagecoach, exactly. But there was a lot of like community newspaper type, not like the Jackson Hole News, but the kind of chapbook, I think they maybe called them, like poetry and things like that were published in these little towns. And there was really cool writing in that sort of stuff, you know? And you kind of wondered why does that sort of writing never show up in a lot of these other, you know, vertical publications and stuff. And I liked the stories that were in Climbing and in Powder and a lot of these other sorts of magazines. And at that time, I definitely didn't feel like the fly fishing industry was getting those sorts of stories out. And I knew that a lot of them were out there.
Well, and your bio states, and I like this. I went deep, right?
You did.
Again, Tom and I have known each other for a lot of years, so I'm like, I got to go back and try to find some of his own words in the early days. So the bio states that the Drake was, quote, founded on the principle that too much contemporary outdoor writing gives away all the answers to people who never learned what the questions were. It's pretty deep.
Well, it was all about providing information. But 21 years ago, you couldn't just do that, with your phone. So that made it important that those sorts of magazines were out there. That's how a lot of people learned how to fly fish or do a lot of these other activities. But the problem is, after you're no longer a beginner, then what do you read? Then what intrigues you? Well, and that's about the culture. And that's what some of these other magazines like Powder, who I ended up working for, but at the time I was heavily influenced by Powder. And
heavily
the type
influenced
of
by magazines outside of the fishing industry.
Exactly. Yes.
And as a young angler, all right, you're doing some guiding, you're getting into the sport. What were you reading? Because obviously when you get into fly fishing, you just want to absorb it all. What were your go-to magazines? Was there anything you actually liked at the time, or were you just disappointed?
No, I liked that era of Outside Magazine. And at that time, that was Tim Cahill, it was Krakauer, David Quammen. I mean, legendary writers that all kind of left shortly thereafter. But that was, I think, the golden age of that magazine for sure. And those writers. I mean, I know this is kind of this is a travel podcast. We talked about travel and travel writing, and Tim Cahill was the best at that lighthearted sort of. I mean, anybody who's ever seen Tim Cahill knows that he wasn't some in shape. He wasn't out there climbing mountains and stuff like that. It wasn't really adventuresome stuff. But I took a travel writing class from Tim Cahill in Livingston, and one of the first things that he said to this class was, never start your story from an airport. I've never forgotten it. I mean, and I still get stories that start from people want to write their travel story chronologically. And they start with the thing that is the most common with anybody who's traveling, flying somewhere is, well, I'll start it with the airplane. And it's a horrible idea because unless it crashes, in which case it's probably more interesting. But other than that, stay away from the
I thought in fly fishing, every piece of writing had to start from the bow of a flats boat with a Bahamian.
10 o'clock, man. Yeah. How are they all the same? It's like remarkable. Okay. You'd think by coincidence that somebody would at least say 9 o'clock, man.
It's always 10 o'clock.
It's unbelievable.
Well, I mean, you put in all this hard work, all these years, the magazine's done well, all these great accolades and achievements that Tom BIE has collected in the fly fishing industry. But it's all for naught because we clearly know that today print is dead. Oh,
clearly. Yes. And it's funny that part of this industry, I mean, I'm in essentially two, in the fly fishing industry and publishing, but I got to say, I go down to pick up copies of the magazine and I feel like a manufacturer. I mean, I am. At the end of the day, I'm manufacturing this $7 product that goes through distribution channels and whatnot. You think of it as media, but that's the difference. If you put your stories online and that's the only place versus actually paying to print something and then charging somebody to come and buy it, it's meaningful, to me. And what's given me the most faith I'm like everybody else, 2008, maybe print was dead. Who knew? I mean, it kind of seemed like it looked at. But I think what's made print healthy now has as much to do with the horrible experience of reading online as anything to do. I mean, you can still print a crappy magazine, but if you're living off something other than advertisers, if you're living in part off selling those things off newsstands, which I have the entire life of the Drake, then it better be good. Because people are walking to that newsstand and picking it over hundreds of other magazines are there, and that's why I like the newsstand. It's a very pure capitalist spot. Jim, I figured you'd appreciate that.
Well, and I mean, you've been told that for years, right? Everybody pitching you these ideas, being like, well, Tom, we all know that print is dead. And how many times have you heard that? And especially now, because it's even gotten stronger, I would say. It has to kind of make you smile and be like, oh, okay, please continue. I definitely want to hear this.
Well, the funny aspect to it is people will ask, are you worried about print dying? And I'm like, I would kill print tomorrow if I had a chance. Are you kidding me? You don't think I want to get rid of a $40,000 print bill and have everybody pay me to read on their laptop? But it just ain't happening. It's not the same experience. It is something about the tactile nature of turning a page, something about, I mean, when there were those iReaders and that sort of thing, those never really sold very well, right? But then manufacturers tried to say, well, they're not selling because all it does is read a book. So let's add in where you can get your email with it. And you can do, And pretty soon then it wasn't a reading experience anymore. Then you were getting interrupted by work.
You're still multitasking.
It's still multitasking. And it's, I don't know. There's something also from an editorial standpoint that the fact that you have to curate your magazine and only put so much in it versus a website, and that forces you to really focus on quality, or at least it should, I mean, it's, because it can only fit so much, you want everything in there to be that much better. And that's the way I look at it.
Well, and that's from an editor standpoint.
Right.
From a reader standpoint, there's still something weird about taking your MacBook into the toilet with you too. I mean, let's be honest. It just feels strange. You're sitting there, you've got your notebook open.
How about the guy at the airport with the conversation on the phone in the stall with the whole men's room full of people, and he's like, "Yeah, Johnny, just calling for my 10 o'clock," and he's like, in the stall.
The toilets are flushing all around him.
Yeah. It's like, really, dude?
All right. Well, so I got to ask you this, because we got to establish a little more groundwork for our listeners that don't know you.
Okay.
Let's talk about some of your key influences and the writers that you were really drawn to, and that in a lot of ways shaped the writer, and then after that the editor that you became. I mean, who were some of those early influences for you?
If it wasn't for David James Duncan, I may not have started the magazine. I can say that for sure. And that's not the kind of writer I am. I mean, he wrote The River Why, and that was the most influential book that I ever read, and a lot of fly fishermen ever read.
And The Brothers K.
And The Brothers K, which is phenomenal.
Insanely good.
Yeah, as good or better. Longer, hard to get through. But if you're a baseball fan and a Duncan fan, it's phenomenal. But The River Why, I mean, I grew up in Oregon. I was on the coast. I mean, I was that age when I read the book. For me, it created such a vivid. I was able to imagine that story like I never had as a kid. Like reading any book,
changed lives. That book.
Yeah, him canoeing in the tidewater and finding a dead guy. I mean, it was incredible writing.
Well, so I have a son named Gus because of that
right,
book. I mean,
right,
absolutely.
Yeah, I had it was a very influential book, and I always thought it was for years. I mean, decades. I thought it was a particular river on the Oregon coast, and I think it was actually a different one. But in either case, that it was just.
You'll be geo-spotting that for us later, though, of course.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Exactly.
That's important. So Duncan, of course, guy's a legend. You've actually gotten to know him and spent
he's
time
written
with
for the
him.
magazine. I had the very first issue, 1998. I ran a story that had never. I think it was in print, maybe in like one of those Portland Underground journals or something like that. But it was a speech he gave the Portland Anglers Club. And again, I wrote him a letter, and he wrote me back and gave me permission to run it. And that helped motivate me to start this crazy thing. And I've told him that story before. But that's one kind of writing. But I'm not really a big fiction guy. I never have been. But even though that was just phenomenal. But then heavily influenced by him, and then heavily influenced on the other side by the reporting types, the Krakauer type newspaper columnists. I mean, people that just wrote in a strong voice influenced me a lot.
Well, let's talk specifically about travel writing, because again, this is a travel podcast. Mm-hmm. Who do you consider some of the greats when it comes to travel writing?
Well, like I said, Cale's one of them for sure. I feel like Into the Woods.
Into the Wild.
No. That is A Walk in the Woods. I'm sorry.
Bryson.
Bryson, yeah, for sure. His Australia book, I think even more so, probably. Just to be able to tie in humor with the travel and things like that. I'm blanking on authors' names right now.
Well, as we keep going here, you can just shout out a name, and we'll know that it relates back to this.
I'll reflect back. But I mean, I was always a magazine reader too, so part of the problem is there's a lot of really bad writing out there, and the worst type of bad writing is travel writing. A lot of it is horrible, and so I didn't tend to read a lot of anything with people that are going to stay in a hotel, or just a lot of your traditional type travel writing is pretty bad.
Well, because so often it's a comp or fam trip, and the expectation is,
Yeah.
come here, experience it, and go back and write about it. And when that's the motivation, so that you can keep doing these kinds of trips, you're going to end up with some mixed material for sure.
Right. Well, but one of the things that makes fly fishing travel so much different than that kind of travel is you may go into a real popular, well-known city, a place where millions of people have been. But if you're a fly fisherman, especially if you're going to Central South America, you're going to end up going really out of the way places. And you're going to spend 3 or 4 days fishing in a place that villagers that have spent their whole life here have never been to. I mean, it happens all the time. It's because the pursuit of fish brings you to these places. And it is one of the greatest things about the sport, you know?
And we always talk about, I mean, and I think about this after all these years, I'm still like, if it weren't for having a fly rod in my hand, I never would have been close to places like this. And you and I have done a bunch of trips together, and places like Nicaragua and some of these coastal villages we've been to, and it's like, what? How did we end up here? There's no way I could have lived my entire life. I wouldn't have even been close to this place.
You should tell the Nicaragua story, unless you'd like me to.
Well, which part?
I mean, we didn't end up going fly fishing. This was remember we'd asked beforehand? Like, Like, hey, is there fly fish? Oh, yeah, absolutely. This is
we get invited down by the Nicaraguan Tourism Bureau to kind of determine the possibilities of fly fishing and destination infrastructure for the country. And so Tom and I, and this was years ago when we were both like, free trip? Yeah, we're in.
We'll check it out.
We'll check it out. So we went down for a couple of weeks and we had a great time, and they showed us around, and we had a tour guide. And
but the guy who had like sponsored it or something was like a geothermal guy. Like that was how he made his money, and he wanted to take us out in his boat. So this is like the first afternoon. We're like, great, fly rods, and they're just looking at us like, what? No, the first words out of the guy, the I guess the mate's mouth or whatever was Rapala. He holds up 2 huge 9-hooked, I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah, put that on the 9-weight. That'll work.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we've had some really, really great trips together, and we've also had some that you come home from just shaking your head, but also great stories. And that's one of the things about.
Well, I have to about the Nicaragua. One more thing I do have to say, I have gotten a lot of credit for holding up that rooster fish that was actually caught by the 9-year-old kid with chicken bones or whatever that you borrowed the fish in. I think I held up the fish.
Oh, yeah, it was like day 9. I'm like, I would love just a picture of a fish.
That was a nice rooster fish, Tom. Hey, thanks. Yeah.
So we and it was dark. And we didn't have a single fish picture. And so I thought, well, if nothing else, and we get to him, and he brings this big rooster fish in. He's hand lined it. It's a nice fish.
Yeah.
He immediately clubs it over the head. It's got like one eyeball popping out. It's covered with sand. And I'm like, we need a fish picture. So we got a shot of Tom holding it up with backlit, sunset. It's a beautiful profile of a rooster fish. It's just dead as shit.
You miss the X's in its eyes.
Yeah. So, we're actually going to post that as your profile picture here for this podcast, just so people can see it, because I think that's a good one. Well, let's talk a little bit about, travel writing or influences or whatever. Having a story. I mean, as a writer, having a story is important. And what makes a great story? What are the components for you that when your standards are high as an editor. Yeah. When you go through a piece and you're like, damn, that is a good story. What is it that makes that?
Well, again, there's 2 different types of things I'm measuring generally. And one of them is just the rhythm and flow and pacing of the writing. It's like when you hear a song for the first time and you don't know why you like it, you just do. If I don't have to stop ever when I'm reading it, that's
and you don't want to stop.
No, because to be honest, I can't get through the first 2 sentences of a lot of the pitches I get. And any editor will tell you that. And so if I get to the end of the story, there's a really good chance that that's going to make it in the magazine. But a lot of times you won't. If it starts out really horrible, I might not even get to that. But the fact is that that's one kind of people that just have a feel for, and then they know how to use words, but that's a great story. A lot of times it is in that essay-ish sort of form. And then there's the people who really know how to research, report, be a journalist. Those are the kind of stories that include a lot more quotes, and they're more and more rare, frankly, because a lot of people didn't grow up in the newspaper world now, so they didn't learn those skills. The other kind of writing there's almost more of, and I'm always impressed with how good that is. And I never assign those tippet essays in the magazine. Never. Those are just submitted from random people, and it keeps it. It's definitely one of the most loved parts of the magazine, and it's for that reason. It's a lot of them are travel based. A lot of them might just be, the kid in his backyard in a bluegill pond. But it's the kind of writing that people maybe would have just kept to themselves before magazines started running these maybe 600 word essay type pieces. And frankly, the influence for me in including that, and that was in the very first issue of the magazine, was it was a commercial product. It was the old Patagonia catalogs, because they used to have those great essays in it, 1 or 2 word titles, and I loved them. I mean, I'm sure maybe other companies were doing it, but at the time it was really cool to be able to see, like, here's these people, a company trying to sell a product, and they're including really good writing along with it and cool photos. But that's what's influenced.
So easier to write a great story in 5,000 words or 500 words?
Great question.
Thank you. I pull out some deep ones every now and then.
No. 5,000 words. I mean, there's certain people that just don't like long stories. They don't feel like enough time. Can't get into it, whatever. But it's if you're talking about a week-long trip or something, obviously you're going to need probably somewhere in between there to even make it, 3,000 to 5,000 words. But you asked me which is harder. Is that right?
Well, which do you prefer and which is harder? Answer both.
Well, people think that writing shorter is easier, and it's not always. Like, and I say that if I'm looking at a 500-word story, or if that's my word count, most writers will tell you it'd be a heck of a lot easier to write. You're going to write 1,000 anyway, and you're going to keep the 500 best. That's kind of how it works, right? But with a 5,000-word story, the important thing, what a lot of writers don't realize is the difference between the two. When you sit down and write a feature story, which is 5,000 is about the high end of it, maybe 6 if it's the New Yorker, 10,000. But the same numbers apply. So you're going to write probably 15,000 to get to a 5,000 really well edited, well thought out feature story. And just to write that first opening graph, I would say if I was giving advice to people who are starting out and tackling their first feature story,
This is when all the listeners are reaching for their pen and paper right here.
Well, it's
Tom's
simple.
going to give some advice.
Write your ending first, because you'll spend days on that intro. You'll spend weeks on that first page, and then get writing, and then you'll be so sick of the story by the time you get to the end that you just stick a period there and call it good. But the ending is as important, if not more. And if you also write that ending first, it'll give you something that you're going toward. You might not know what it is, but it may hit you halfway through the story. But it's just it's something that gives that, if your story has a narrative arc to it, which it should, you have an end goal in mind. And you won't spend as much time on just that first page.
Well, so let me ask you this. So, sorry, I'm making some notes here because I'm going to come back to that. I really like what you just said. You talked about how there's a lot of writers today that didn't come up in the newspaper world and the reporting world and the journalism, from fly fishing writing and travel writing and angling travel writing. Is there any hope for the future? I mean, do we have any up and coming writers that have really impressed you?
Yes. That's what I was talking about in tippets, that kind of writing. There's not a lot of journalists, or if there are, they're just harder to find, or they're mid-70s working at a newspaper. I had to pause because, I'll be there. We'll all be there eventually, but it is just not the kind of skill set that a lot of younger people have learned. I don't think they're opposed to it. But the flip side, these essays I get, some of them it's amazing how good a lot of them are. I mean,
there's hope.
There is. There absolutely is. I think that kind of, people think about writing. There's way more outlets now for writing than there ever was. And if you're good at it, people will buy it, for sure. But if you learn how to, if you're already that kind of a good essay writer, if you learn just a few of the editing and research skills and incorporate those into it, then you're really good. Then you're twice as good as you were before. And it's not twice as much work. if that makes sense. It's just incorporating the, research. And don't be afraid to pick up the phone. Don't email someone for quotes, ever. Because if you're reading it, you can tell it was an email. Those are called wooden quotes. They're what you get from PR firms or anybody that's sending you a press release. It's the quote that the person that it's attributed to never said it, doesn't even know what the quote is because some assistant wrote it. And you never use it in the story. It's horrible. But that's the kind of quotes you get if you're trying to do too much emailing back and forth instead of getting them on the phone.
Wow. So that's journalism. I mean, that's how it used to be. You'd pick up the phone and say, you're on the record, and let's hear your words.
Yes. Yeah. And if their words suck, keep asking them questions until they say something that doesn't suck.
Well, you talked about, the senior writers. I've been doing it for a lot of years.
Right.
I think one of the requirements now is you have to change your name so it's an initial, then your middle name, and then your last name. So instead of,
ideally followed by a third.
Yeah. Instead of Jim Klug, it's, J. Thomas Klug, because then you're a senior writer.
You need three somethings in there for sure.
All right. So, you talk about writers. You've been an editor for a long time. Powder Magazine, the Drake, the 8-man football beat and Jackson Sports.
Paddler Magazine, don't forget that.
Paddler Magazine.
Skiing when it was a thing.
Yeah. So you once said in an interview, and I'm going to quote you on this too, that for good writers to become great writers, they need great editors. And great editors are in short supply. I mean, you obviously feel strongly about that.
Yes, I was very lucky. Like, at the time when I grew up, and I was freelancing at the time for money. And I had a couple magazines I wrote for, not often, but got feature stories outside in Men's Journal. And those magazines were paid $1.50 a word in the 90s, and that was a good paycheck. What I didn't realize at the time was how much I was learning. I earned twice that just from being able to work with the top editors at those magazines at the time, how much I learned from them. And that's what I mean.
Your pay was knowledge.
Exactly.
It was the Bitcoin of the time.
Exactly. The Bitcoin of outdoor writing. But there are, again, there's not as many of those magazines around now, and there's not as many editors like that you have access to as a freelancer.
All right. So I'm going to bring up a topic right now that, a lot of us have a love-hate relationship with this, especially in our industry. And that's the tidal wave that is social media these days. Instagram, Facebook, videos, you name it, endless platforms that have given rise to this culture, especially in the fishing and fly fishing world, of if you don't post it, it didn't happen. Mm-hmm. Game changer for everything. I mean, what are your thoughts on this right now? And I know that's a big kind of giant question, but what is social media doing to your profession, all right, as a writer and an editor and in the magazine business? How is it impacting what you do with the Drake and with the written word in general? And then what is it doing to our sport as a whole? And those are two big questions. Right. So start with first what it's doing to writing, and then we'll move on to the next.
Well, like everybody else, there's times I look at it and get really upset, but I don't hate it. I mean, it's if I'm being honest, it's 50-50, like how I'm helped by it, both in writing it. Like, for example, I'm looking for a good photographer. Well, I discover people on there. I also get pissed if I see a photo that a photographer, I may email her or email him and be like, dude, I would have paid you, nothing for that. And you gave up that to get also nothing. No, at least $100, $200. I'm just like, you realize that you could be getting money for that. On the flip side is beginning photographers, they can get discovered there. And I've certainly reached out to photographers I've seen there that I would not have seen otherwise. So from that respect, there's good and bads about it. The sport of fly fishing is a lot harder. But even there's good and bads. A lot more people learn how to handle fish. They learn how to, they may not do it, but I think you're really seeing that the pressure to handle them better, and a lot of that wasn't available for people to learn in that way.
It's a learning tool through like crowdsourcing abuse.
Exactly.
Do something wrong and you're going to get roasted. You're like, well, I don't want to do that again.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of that. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's deserved, and in either case, and I do hope that the people that are just starting out in fly fishing or in fishing in general, that they're not getting beat up too bad over that sort of. They're so excited for their first fish, and then they just get annihilated by the guy who's been fishing for 2 weeks instead of 1 week, like that person, and just letting them know all the rights and wrongs. But again, it's I think to some degree, the people who are not on social media at all, we were talking about this last night, Brian and I were, about how sometimes that now becomes even more valuable, right? I mean, especially with the kind of fishing when they're kind of hermits anyway, steelheaders, especially winter steelheaders, the ones you really want the knowledge of are the ones that aren't putting that stuff out there anyway.
Yeah, the druids.
Exactly. I see them once every.
It's like a secret
years.
Society. They're not posting daily.
Totally.
Well, but I mean, we're seeing a lot of blowback these days from the whole Insta famous crowd. It's like, oh, I went fly fishing for the first time 2 years ago, and now I'm a guide, and I'm putting myself out there as a guide, and look at my sweet pro deals.
Right.
And there's some blowback that's occurring from this, and people are getting kind of pissed.
Sure. I just think that'll kind of work itself out. I mean, it's annoying, but I just think it's not something I waste a lot of breath over, because it's here, and there's people that are going to go out there and take advantage of it. And if they can go out there and make a living doing it, I mean, more power to it. You're also seeing like one of the most popular commercials on TV right now is the couple in the van. I mean, a lot of people also make fun of it. I mean, I look at it this way. People sit around and say, God, I really should have read more this summer. I told myself I was going to read 3 books this summer. I haven't even read one. I've never heard anybody sit around and say, I really need to spend more time on Instagram. I'm not feeling like I'm getting my potential of, and you can look on your phone and be like, are you kidding me? 6 hours I spent. I mean, you're reminded of how much time you've wasted on there. Unless I'm, checking beef scores or something that's important. But a lot of the other stuff, I just think nobody feels that good about spending that much time on it. And
so
I think that makes
let me ask you this, and again, I like to bring this back to travel every now and again on this show, but social media and what that's done for travel. For especially fly fishing travel, people go out, and now you look through an Instagram feed, and it's not just, here's this beautiful rainbow I caught in the Madison. It's like, look at my roosterfish, look at my arapaima, look at this sweet payara.
It's next level epic.
After I was rappelling into this canyon, and so how has the social media phenomenon impacted fly fishing travel, in your opinion?
Well, again, you can certainly learn a lot about, what places look like, and you can reach out to those people and say, where's that river, hotel, mountain, trail, whatever. It certainly has affected the smaller towns, and there's just certain iconic things that are Instagrammable, and those places are getting pounded and overrun. If it's the Tetons, it's one thing. If it's some little statue in a small city in Italy, it's like they maybe can't handle as much traffic, But I also think it's probably spread out the crowds in a lot of situations where, people are maybe a little bit more willing to go out there and try to see something new, at least on social media wise. And you see a really, really cool picture of a mountain, a river. Some people love it to be the iconic thing that everybody recognizes right away. But what catches my eye is, I've never seen that before. Where's that mountain, rock formation, whatever it is? And so that's kind of, hopefully there's a certain number of people that are more inclined to try to go do that than keep pounding the more known places.
Well, so one thing I'll ask you about is, we're a sport, and the resources that we love and depend on are obviously these days just under constant assault by, from every angle, it seems, whether it's public access, whether it's, clean water law, whether, it's extractive resources. I mean, you name it. Right. It seems like there's just so many threats out there. What are the ways that social media can help with that? I mean, to be able to, spread the word, call attention to these issues or these right. efforts or organizations that are trying to do good work. I mean, would you say there's some positives coming out of that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I would say if you're a corporation are a company that has a budget you set aside to have these influencers, have them also represent a nonprofit or at least one group that is not paying you. It doesn't have the money to pay you, and make it part of their contract. Do something out there that a lot more people are active in that and on the conservation side of things. But I think, and I put myself in this category as well, we're not doing enough to come up with the other solutions. And I mean, like everybody else, I've fought Pebble Mine because I think it's the worst place in the world to do what they're wanting to do. But what I don't see enough of is, but that is copper, which is needed to make wind power. Where we're going to get it. Let's hear more about what the next option is then. And I just don't think we're going to get to solving any of these major problems. I mean, if I have to pick one issue, and anybody that reads the magazine knows this, it's going to be those Columbia River steelhead. I'm worried that they're going to be, I mean, it's in a really bad place right now. Everybody has bad years, but now it's been 6 years in a row. What's the solution other than just bitching?
You bring up such a good point, though, and we actually talk about this a lot at Yellow Dog with our employees, and people come in. We've got a fairly large staff now, and they say, look, we've got a problem. I'm upset about something. This isn't working. We have something that's broken here. And they know my rule is, okay, you're allowed to start a conversation that way, but the complete conversation that you have to have is, now I've been thinking about it and I have some solutions and I have some ideas on how we can make it better. And it needs to be a two-part discussion on everything, whether it's, a situation in the office on efficiency or a broad kind of spectrum, big picture conservation issue. I don't know that it's enough to be like, yeah, this is complete bullshit. We need to stop this. Everyone needs to rally around, send money. We're up in arms about this because we have to prevent this from happening. But you bring up a good point. It's like, okay, so what's part two of that?
No, that it's a great office rule. I mean, I had an ex-employee at one point in my career that loves to give me we're editorial meeting, but sitting around, I'm not feeling it. Like, I'd look at him, well, what are you feeling? You can't just say you're not feeling it unless you have a plan B. We're on deadline here. We need, but that it's same sort of deal. If you don't like the current situation, what's happening, it's great to bitch about it. It's important that we all get together and bitch about that which is wrong, but let's maybe work a little harder on the solution side as well. And I'm certainly putting myself in that category as well, as much me as anybody else.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, again, we've traveled all over the world over the years together. You love to travel. You once told me that your parents never had passports for most of their lives, and that other than being sent to Korea, your dad never really traveled at all.
No, that was a very exotic trip for him.
Yeah. didn't have a lot of say in where he was going. But, do you ever think about that fact and kind of how far your life has come from that of your parents when you find yourself, 10,000 miles from home on some super remote island or trekking along a river somewhere in South America, and it just kind of helps you put it in perspective about.
Yeah. I mean, not just my parents. I'm just an incredibly fortunate person to be able to do what I do. I mean, I work really hard at it. I know you do too, but still the opportunities that I've been given, especially with travel, I could not have imagined in me doing anything else. I mean, journalism pays poorly, but the perks are fantastic. If you're willing to work hard on the, writing side, and it's people like reading your stories. I mean, I've just been super spoiled with it. I mean, I was editor of Powder for 3 years. I could ski anywhere in the world with a phone call. Boom, there. And it's definitely hard to drive up I-70 and pay $200 for a lift ticket after having had that in your past. I can tell you that. But I've just been super fortunate to be able to travel. My dad fought in the Korean War. That was a little harder travel, I think, than a good check. I was in the Army, but I was protecting discotheques or something. I didn't go to war. No active duty there in that.
Well, another thing we both have in common, right? We wore the uniform, didn't do a whole lot. We had a good time.
And people, I mean, veterans deserves, so much credit when people are like, well, thank you for your service. I'm like, I mean, thank you for thanking me, but I didn't really. There's other guys out there that worked much harder than I did in the Army.
Well, let me ask you, because you're talking about how fortunate you've been to travel to these places. What's the ideal mindset, in your opinion, for someone who wants to travel and fish, to explore new places, step out of their comfort zone? Is it all about like, look, I got to get in there. I'm super aggro. What am I going to catch? What am I going to do? I mean, how do you get more enjoyment out of your travel experiences with, a certain type of mindset?
Another great question. And I know the answer, but it's very hard to just tell someone to do that. And that is because I was that aggro person. Like a lot of people are when they're first starting out and think you're not going to have a chance to do that anymore. And I always make the analogy that for me, in those first couple of years, especially like permit fishing, things where I'm like, I have 2 days, I may get one shot. I compare it to going in to get a massage and you can't enjoy it because you're sitting there the whole hour just being like,
because you're next to
think
Robert,
about when it's going to end.
I was going to say you're next to Robert Kraft, and then it's just awkward.
That's a little awkward. What's up, Rob? But yes, just the idea of going in and relaxing enough to enjoy that day you have, even if it's the only day you have. You're going down, you're taking one day in Ascension Bay because you had to go to some wedding in Cancun or whatever, and it's hard to relax when you're like, I only have one day. Don't pressure yourself. You got the rest of your life to keep at this sport, and eventually you're going to get one and try to take in it's easier said than done, but the more you do it, the more you can relax and enjoy. You realize that catching that fish really isn't the part of it anyway. So it becomes easier, but that'd be my best advice to you.
Well, that is good advice. Well, I want to bring it back to writing, to travel writing. It used to be a thing for a lot of people when they would travel the world, whether it was, a cruise in the 20s or whatever, to keep a travel journal, right? This was a thing. And a lot of people would write and record their adventures on a daily basis. Do you still keep a travel journal even when you're not out there writing for a story? And I'm actually going to preface this with one story about you, because I think we were in the Seychelles. We got to Mahe one time, and we were actually there for a legitimate story. We were covering the whole piracy deal, and you were going to interview the guy that had been kidnapped and taken to Somalia, and it was
very serious topic.
Very, very serious topic. And I think we got to the airport, and you're like, oh, shit, I forgot a notebook. And we go into like an airport gift shop or something, and you got a beautiful little, there was a starfish on the cover, and I think it was
bow.
It was a bow,
like 2 inches by 2 inches,
and it came with like a
pencil.
A touristy bamboo pencil. And I'll never forget that. We finally sit down with this guy who has been through this ordeal in Somalia, and he's been kidnapped by pirates. Like, do you mind if I take notes? And you open your starfish
journal. Got
journal.
like a doily on it. Excuse me. So, yes.
But I mean, the travel journal, is that still a thing?
It is. And I kept one for years before I was really being paid to write. I have a good 6 or 7 years of like really good ones, but now, no. I mean, the Drake is my travel journal for the most part.
You ever go back and read those early travel journals?
I do. There's a lot of stuff in there that's not just travel, but there's some. I mean, the travel then was like it was a 9-mile trip hiking into Yellowstone backcountry or whatever.
But I thought it always started at the airport.
I did, absolutely. It's on a camel or whatever it is. But yes, I think it's important to do it though, because you don't realize how much you forget, and it is great to be able to go back and look at those journals and I try to do some of that in a magazine if I can, and that style of writing.
It's you built up something pretty cool, I have to say it. And you get a lot of submissions. You get guys sending stuff in all the time, and sometimes you're very gracious about it. You're like, well, you're not quite there yet, or maybe we can work with this. But sometimes you get pieces that are just clearly not there, and you like to send back a little video clip from the movie The Motorcycle.
It's on the website.
It's on the website.
A direct writer's guideline. It's
Tell
on
us
the
about
writer's
that.
guidelines page. Well, it's all joking aside, it's the hardest part of my job. I mean, everybody tells you, you can just be honest. They want you to be honest. No, they don't. Most of the time they don't. Some people do, but they've been told by their friends, this is really great. You should send it to the Drake. They've just been on a yellow dog trip. My buddy Jim told me to send it to you. No, but it is hard. It's always hard. And you can tell some people don't really care that much. They're just doing it, maybe trying it as a hobby. And there's other people that are like, yeah, I just quit my job as a podiatrist and I'm going to be a travel writer. What do you think? The idea with that movie clip is that it's better as an editor to be honest up front. And that's all that clip was about. And the person hearing the advice, not what he wanted to hear, but he really appreciated that Ernesto or whatever was honest with.
Well, tell us the clip.
Well, it's from the Motorcycle Diaries. If you've seen the movie, they're about ready to get up on a boat, and the doctor that they had stopped there and visited with had kept on trying to get Ernesto Che, right? That's who it's supposed to be, and to read his manuscript and tell him what he thinks. So they get up to leave, and he comes running down the dock, says, "What do you think?" And his buddy kind of tries to speak for both of them. Say, he loved it. No, I want to hear it from Ernesto. He was subtle at first, just like, well, it wasn't horrible, this, that. And the doctor's like, well, that's not so bad. And then Ernesto's like, no, it was basically unreadable. I think you should stick to what you do best, being a doctor. And that was my way of saying, before you send it to me and tell me honestly what you want, maybe just watch this clip. And a lot of people watch it because they put it in their notes to me when they send me a manuscript or something like that.
It was unreadable.
Basically, it wasn't real. No, it was bad. It's just bad. It's a great clip.
It is. Well, Tom, this has been awesome, man. Thanks for sitting down. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jim.
Let me ask you this. So
Sure.
One final question, and because you said this a few minutes ago, write the end of the story first. And what is the end of the story for Tom BIE? Where does this go from here?
More coastal time, perhaps. I see that. And other than that, I see myself continuing to write always. I mean, I don't see why I'd ever quit. I love the job that I have, and I just think there's an awful lot of stories yet that I would like to write on both sides. Some travel stories, some essay-ish, and I like doing the other kinds of stories too. As long as I can keep doing that, that'll be what I'll do to the end.
Awesome. Well, thanks for spending time with us. We
Thanks,
really appreciate it. And that's it for this episode of Waypoints, the podcast that is 100% dedicated to travel, adventure, and exploration. Join us for our next episode of Waypoints. And remember, no matter where you go or what you're doing, that no one ever regretted a life of adventure.
This has been another episode of Waypoints, the podcast of fly fishing travel and adventure angling. Thank you for joining us, and be sure to visit yellowdogflyfishing.com for more trip updates, travel news, expert advice, and adventure profiles.